Welcome to episode 2 of the akaCatholic podcast. I'm your host, Louis Verrecchio. And some disappointing news for you. I'm not going to be joined today by Father Campo. I'm going to be flying solo yet again. I'm sure he wouldn't mind me telling you this. Father Campo is caring for his elderly mom back in Spain. And she's been hospitalized lately. Looks like she's doing better. God willing, will be discharged today or tomorrow. But in the meantime, please keep Father Campo in your prayers, as well as his mom, for her healing and for his strength. And I'm sure he will appreciate your petitions on his behalf. So look forward to maybe getting together with him next week, God willing, and we'll talk about tradiciones, cojones, and the assault on the traditional liturgy, masterminded by Jorge Bergoglio and carried out with his henchman, Arthur Roach. So we can look forward to that. Today, I'm just going to talk about a couple of things, beginning with some commentary on my latest article at akaCatholic, The War on Masculinity. In this article, if you haven't read it, please do. Kind of go over the history of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And even though these are great men of our faith, the church considers them saints, and of course they are. They had some momentary and stunning lapses in manfulness and manliness and carrying out their role as head of their household, protectors of their wives and children in an absolutely remarkable way. And I kind of recount for readers some of those incidents for your consideration. And I've brought this point up before in other venues, and people have responded by saying, yeah, I understand that they can see that there's some lapses in manhood there, but the culture at that time truly disregarded women and didn't place the same value on women as they did on men. And there's some truth to that. But that said, we can't blame the culture for that. The point that I make in the article still stands, and that's that it's detachment from Christ. It's disbelief in him. It's a lack of trust in him and his promises that leads to men failing to be men. That's what lies at the heart of it. And it was just as true for the patriarchs as it is for us today. The fact of the matter is, men are called to be protectors, not just of their own family, not just of their own wife and children, but protectors of society in general, of women and children more broadly speaking, of the weak and the innocent. That's what men are called to do. And you look at, that's an objective truth. It's the way we were created, and we can see that. It's part of human nature as it was created by God. And we see it in the Garden of Eden. I'll return to that in a moment. But look at our culture today. We have fallen so far from human nature and the way that we were created, whereby men are protectors of their families and of society as a whole, that we're sending women into combat. We have women on every major city's police force today. It's ridiculous. And I don't want to hear this argument about, oh, well, if a woman wants to be a cop, well, she should be. No, I'm so sorry. She should not be a cop. Why? Because women are way too valuable for that. They deserve to be among the protected, not the protectors. And that's the way God created us. We look at the creation account in Genesis. When God charges Adam with protecting, tilling, caring for the garden, there's a variety of different translations for what he was charged to do. But the Hebrew word is shamar, and it appears throughout the Old Testament, and it's more accurately translated as protect the garden, to guard the garden. And this is what he was conscripted by God to do. He was created by God to do that. It was part of his nature as God created it. You are the guard. You are the protector of the garden, is essentially what he's telling Adam. But what did Adam do? He stayed silent in the face of this challenge against Eve, the bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. And so that's a monumental failing, and it takes place right at the very beginning of the story of creation. at the creation of humankind. And there's something going on here that theologians have spoken about this. In an eschatological sense, there's kind of a de-evolution of mankind where we're descending further and further into a place of depravity, where we're denying human nature as God created it. We can see it happening in our time, and it's accelerating, and it began right there in Eden. But of course, throughout the story of salvation history, going from Adam to the patriarchs and further on through the prophets, when we get to Christ, we reach a culmination of salvation history where, we have something that the patriarchs could never even dream of. We have the church, we have the New Testament, we have the New Covenant, we have the sacraments, starting with baptism. We have sanctifying grace. And all of these things allow us to live up to our nature and even to aspire beyond it, to become like unto God. And we have the divine life within us in a way that even Adam didn't have. And so, for men, I would draw your attention to Ephesians chapter 5, because in Ephesians chapter 5, we're exhorted to be and to do exactly what the patriarchs failed to be and failed to do. And that is to lay down our lives for our wives, for our families, if that should become necessary. And these aren't just empty words of exhortation. Not only did God give us through the sacred scriptures this directive and telling us how to behave as men and as husbands and as fathers, we're given the grace to do it. We have the grace to stand firm and the grace to lay down our lives if, God forbid, we're ever called to do that. So manliness is, as I say in the article, it's really about being faithful. That's the key to being manful and manly. It's being Christ-like. It's being selfless. It's choosing to labor over comfort even. And that comes in many different ways. I mean, it can mean just getting up and going to work every day when you don't feel like it. For men, especially as we get a little bit older, get to midlife and beyond, as I said in my article, so many men my age and even younger, my gosh, they've let themselves go. They're sloppy fat. They're in pain. They're out of breath. They don't have the energy to be good men. So, putting labor over comfort might mean, picking up weights 2 or 3 times a week to make sure you still have a little bit of strength in case you have to physically protect your family one day. So many men in their 40s and 50s and 60s are in such pathetic condition today that they can't, they're unable to serve as protectors. Best they can do is pick up their iPhone and dial 911 and hope to God the police get there before something terrible goes down. But anyway, I have a handful of pet peeves about men in our day. And I've said this before, and I'm serious about it. I have so many peeves, it's not fair to point to any of them as pets. I just have a laundry list of peeves. I'm not going to give them all to you, but I want to share with you some of my pet peeves about the way men behave in our day. And I pointed to one of them in my article. Men who will say without embarrassment somehow, happy wife, happy life. I've got to tell you, even if I believe that, you couldn't get me to say that publicly at gunpoint. It's demeaning, degrading, it's embarrassing, it's pathetic. Worse still, I've encountered men where a decision needs to be made, plan needs to be made, but the response is, well, let me go home and run it by the boss. Fellas, if that's the mantra by which you live, if that's the way in which your household is ordered, that your wife is the boss, even if you're saying that tongue-in-cheek, knock it off. Keep it to yourself, please. You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing your family. And you're just perpetuating this terrible imagery of manhood and the way men are, the way they're projected and the way they're characterized in popular culture nowadays as these bumbling idiots that can't do anything on their own. And that brings me to the next pet peeve that I have, and that is when there's a husband and wife, a couple, and they're in a situation. For example, I was in sales for a lot of years, and I can't tell you how many times I would have a couple in front of me, a husband and wife, and we're negotiating a sail. And she's, just chattering away. She's carrying the water. And the husband's sitting there like a big dummy with nothing to say. I find that just humiliating and embarrassing. I'm not saying that a husband and wife, when they're buying their next car, or they're buying a home, or they're investing in home improvements, or whatever it might be, that she shouldn't have some input. Absolutely. Ask some questions, make some points, bring up some ideas, what have you. But man, we should be the ones that are the spokespersons for our families. We're the heads of the household. And you see it all the time. At least I did frequently. When I was in sales, you'd have these situations where it was obviously who wore the pants in the family. And it wasn't the idiot husband. He had just relinquished it. Maybe he never had that role. But it's just disconnected from human nature as God created it. And when you encounter it, I find it really disturbing. And sometimes the subject matter is, a whole lot more serious. I can remember seeing an interview conducted, and this is more than 10 years ago. It was parents of an elementary school child somewhere in the U.S., and they were engaged in a battle with the school board because this child is supposedly a trans girl. It's a little boy that they dress up like a girl. And they were arguing a case against their local school because they wanted this little boy to be able to use the little girl's room. And they were interviewed on a national program. I think it was Good Morning America, but I'm not sure about that. And the wife is sitting there just chattering away about this supposedly trans kid that, ever since he was old enough to articulate thoughts and ideas, he insisted that he's a girl. I think she might have even said he was less than 2 years old when he started talking about the fact that he's a girl. I don't believe that for a second. But throughout that interview, the husband's sitting there like just a big dummy, nothing to say. And I think that's a snapshot of a lot of these families where you have these supposed trans kids. You have a psychotic, out of her mind, mentally ill mother who's exercising control over this situation, and you have a weak, pathetic, idiot husband sitting there letting it happen. I had one of my friends on Twitter, a follower, I can't remember who it was, so I'm sorry I can't give you credit, but said something to the extent that in these situations where you have a young child who's being pushed down the trans road, the mom is sick with this Munchausen's by proxy kind of thing. Like there's something wrong with mom, probably in 95% or more of these cases. And I think that person's onto something. I would only add to it that right behind that mentally ill mother is a pathetic and weak husband. And without those two things in tandem, you wouldn't have this explosion of children being mutilated and encouraged to go down this transsexual road that they're on today. And that reminds me, there's a divorced couple in Canada where the husband is in legal trouble because he's been doing everything he can to try to prevent his ex-wife, this nut job of a mother of his son, from taking him through the steps to becoming a trans girl. It's unbelievable. So that's one of the symptoms of the problem that we have in our society today, where there's a lack of masculinity, the trans movement. It's a good example of just how sick things can get when men are not behaving as they should. Give you another one of my pet peeves when it comes to men, and this one's not quite as serious. And look, I'm being judgmental here. I'll admit it. I have no idea what's going on when I see this, but I quickly make judgments that the man is pathetic. So look, if I'm on the highway driving and I see a couple, a husband and wife, sometimes there's kids in the car, sometimes there's not. But if she's driving and he's sitting in the passenger seat, sightseeing and flipping through his iPhone, I find that pathetic. I do. Look, I understand. I don't know what's going on in that car. For all I know, the guy doesn't have legs. I don't know. Maybe he doesn't have a driver's license. I don't know that either. Maybe he's sick. Maybe they're coming back from the hospital and he just got discharged. I couldn't tell you. But I see it so many times that I'm certain that it's not always something like that. That it's because mommy's in charge. At least at that very moment. she's in charge of driving that vehicle and negotiating traffic while the husband's sitting there in the passenger seat relaxing. I find that ridiculous. I don't passenge as my wife negotiates traffic. She's a decent enough driver, not as good as I am, but she's okay. It's not that. It's that I'm in charge. I'm the one that's going to deliver her and my kids if they're in the car, or my grandchildren. I'm the one that's going to get us where we need to go safely. That's my role, not hers. So when we go places, I negotiate traffic. She relaxes to the extent that that's possible given the way that I drive. But you understand what I'm saying. And I know that this particular problem, if you would allow that it's a problem, it infects traditional families. I see it all the time, and I don't mean to insult anybody, and they might know me and practices that and is going to feel slighted as a result. But look, if that's you, gentlemen, get behind the wheel. And don't give me this stuff. Well, it's her minivan, whatever. I don't care whose minivan it is. It belongs to your family. Your family's in there. You take charge. You deliver them where they need to go safely. Give you another one. And this one is the last one I'm going to give you, and it's probably the least serious of them all, but it irks me. I have to admit, this one irks me. You're walking through a grocery store, and yes, I will walk through a grocery store to pick up groceries. Why? Because I'm an Italian guy, and Italian guys cook, and nobody picks out the good meats and the good cheeses and the nice tomatoes or what have you like an Italian guy. I can talk to my wife all day long about the good imported cheese and which one to get and which one to leave. And look, if I want it right, I have to do it myself. So I don't mind walking through the grocery store. But when I do, and I see a man, and even a woman, but when I see a man especially, leaning on the cart and walking with it like it's a walker that you would find in an old age home community, that irks me to no end. Seriously. And 9 times out of 10, it's some sloppy fat guy leaning on the cart, walking like the mezzamorte, the half dead. Stand up, stand up, get your shoulders back a little bit and walk like you have a little bit of dignity. It's just that image of the beaten down, weak, breathless man. It just drives me crazy. So that's enough about that kind of rant. So I'm going to go back now to my article from yesterday. We went through Adam, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And of all those guys, the one story that I can relate to is the story of Jacob, and more particularly his sons, Simeon and Levi. For those of you that didn't read the article, brief recap. Jacob's daughter, Dinah, was raped by the local prince in a land in which they were dwelling. And when he found out about what happened, the scriptures tell us he held his peace. In other words, he didn't react. He said nothing about it. When Simeon and Levi, her brothers, heard about it, they were over the top angry. They were incensed that this prince had taken it upon himself to deflower their sister. And so they reacted the way men should react. They went about defending her honor. Right? Now, granted, they might have overreacted a little bit. They ended up killing every man in that place, including, of course, the prince who had raped their sister. But when all of this went down, Jacob was angry, not at the rapist. No, he was angry at Simeon and Levi for potentially inviting difficulty upon himself. Like having killed these men would anger the surrounding area, and he would be killed. His primary concern was his own comfort and his own safety. And Simeon and Levi, for their part, they responded to their father incredulously, as if to say, well, not as if to say, they did say to him, they should treat our sister as a strumpet. In other words, a prostitute, a strumpet. I love that word. I think we need to reintroduce that into the common vernacular, a strumpet. I'm going to find ways to use it moving forward. But I can identify with that. Abraham and Isaac instructing their wives to pretend that they're sisters, essentially consigning them to the carnal desires of the rulers of whatever area they were in to save their own hide. That's so reprehensible. You can't even fathom that anyone could behave that way. But this story of Simeon and Levi, those are my kind of guys. I'm going to share a brief personal story with you. Some years ago, my oldest sister was being stalked by a former boyfriend. And the situation got at hand to the point where he actually broke into her home. And he was seen there by my nephew who was home, and he didn't know it. So the police were called. And as all these things are going down, my siblings don't tell me when there's a problem like this because they know I'm going to, react immediately and probably overreact. So I find these things out at the last minute. So I'm informed at the last moment that this idiot broke into my sister's house. He's been stalking her for months. The police were called. Nothing was done. They didn't even go visit the guy to talk to him, to tell him to back off. The best they could do is to tell my sister to file paperwork with the court and request a restraining order. She did that. But those things take time. I think it was about a 10-day period between that incident and her day in court to petition the court for a restraining order. So there's 10 days there. And look, we've all seen news stories and documentaries about stalkers who, even with a restraining order in place, have circled back and literally killed their victims. So, I mean, this is serious business. When somebody descends to the level of stalking another human being, something bad is, very likely to happen. So, of course, I immediately went to visit this guy to impress upon him as best I could that his behavior was not going to be tolerated. The upshot of this whole scene was I was charged with felony assault and burglary. I didn't steal anything. I didn't take his stereo or his television, but that's what they call it in Maryland when you force your way into another person's domicile. But he wouldn't let me, and so I had to do what I had to do. But long story short, I was convicted of a lesser charge, a misdemeanor. I had a criminal record for many years as a result. I just finally had it expunged so that I could buy a handgun and obtain a carry permit, which I did. But my point is this: that's how a man reacts to some predator seeking out his sister. So I love that story about Simeon and Levi. I look at them as heroes. As I pointed out in my article, biblical commentary provided by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and I provided a link in my article, their take on that whole story is that Simeon and Levi are to be blamed for endangering the broader family for selfish interests of some such nonsense, they said. But, that's the feminized USCCB commenting on a story about how two men react as men to someone assaulting their sister, right? I think that's the right thing. So one of the other things that I mentioned briefly in the article yesterday was this magnificent scene in Genesis, I want to say chapter 15, where Abraham is pressing God, saying, you promised me all of these offspring, and my wife Sarai is barren. She's still without child. She's elderly. I'm elderly. How do I know you're going to actually come through and I'm going to have, these descendants? And God bids Abraham to step outside and to look to the sky and to number the stars if you're able. And it's a magnificent scene. And if you read the scriptures closely, what happens shortly thereafter is the sun goes down. And God condescends to engage in this ritual act of solidifying and codifying their covenant, as it was. But the wonderful thing about it is, if you're paying attention, when Abraham is looking skyward in order to try to number the stars, it's daytime. So of course he can't number them. He can't even see them. And it occurs to me that this scene is something like what's going on today with regard to the church. The church is indefectible. We know that as a matter of faith. We know that the church is visible and will remain so until the end of time. We can be certain about that. And so in the aftermath of my conversation with Brian McCall and Father Campo on the Catholic Family News YouTube channel, which, by the way, part 2 was posted last week. The third and final part should be posted soon. I make a pretty big to do of repeatedly saying that the conciliar church in Rome today, under the headship of Jorge Bergoglio, cannot be the Holy Roman Catholic Church, indefectible and invisible. And we know that. Why? Because it's a dispensary of error. It leads people directly off of the path of salvation. The exact opposite of the purpose for which our Lord established the Catholic Church. That can't be the church because it endangers souls. And Holy Mother Church never does that. And so I'm seeing in the comments section some people that are just hell-bent and determined to put words in my mouth. Oh, well, he's claiming the Catholic Church doesn't exist anymore. No. What I'm telling you is, if you are looking for the Catholic Church visible until the end of time, if you're looking for it today, God bless you. I'm with you. I'm going to try to help you find it in a future episode. It's there to be found. But given the circumstances that we're living in today, it's kind of like that scene in Genesis 15 where Abram is looking at the daytime sky. As a matter of natural knowledge, he has to know the stars are there. They're there. As the sun begins to set, they start to become more and more visible. They're there even at high noon, but he can't see them in the present circumstance, yet he knows they're there. And I think the same thing is going on with the Holy Catholic Church today. We know as a matter of faith, without any question whatsoever, that the church, visible to the end of time, is present and with us today. She may be difficult to see, but she's every bit as there as those stars were there on the day that Abram was looking skyward past the glowing sun, hoping to see them. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to leave you with this. There was a news story in the past week of some poor man, probably mentally ill, maybe just a flaming liberal. It's very much the same thing. But he went into St. Peter's Basilica, got himself buck naked, and climbed up on the main altar. Reprehensible act, but that's what happened. And why did he do it? Well, he did it to protest the war in Ukraine. I don't know if this guy was truly off his rocker or whether he's just a flaming freaking liberal, but what is it with these liberals and their fascination with Ukraine? They are, my impressions of the liberals in my life is that, these are the same people that were all in with the COVID madness and hysteria. Why? Because, look, we're programmed in a sense to live our lives for something greater than ourselves. And these people are spiritually dead, folks. Some of them claim to have faith, but ultimately the God they serve is the one that looks at them in the mirror every day when they brush their teeth. Let's be honest. They're spiritually empty, and they're looking for meaning in their lives. And COVID gave them something bigger than themselves that they could hurl themselves into, with gusto. Well, Ukraine now started to fill that void. And so you've got this nonsense surrounding the war in Ukraine, and a lot of innocent people are suffering on both sides of that battle. Lives are being lost. The whole thing, though, is drenched in theater, pure theater. These liberals sit there in front of their TVs and their computers, and they think they know what's going on. They don't know anything that the powers that be don't want to show us, and a lot of it is theater. I mean, look at this little jerk, Zelensky, traveling around the world in army fatigues like he's just crawling off of a battlefield. What a magnificent joke. And, anyway, these nut jobs on the left will sit there and eat up this bollocks like it's, the most magnificent food they've ever tasted. It's sickening. Anyway, back to St. Peter's Basilica. This naked dude gets up on the altar. So what he did there in canonical terms is that he violated this sacred space, this sacred space that was consecrated. It's now been violated, and it needs to be rectified. Well, in the aftermath of that event, I took a look through Canon Law, and I have a fantastic resource that's worth getting your hands on if you're interested in Canon Law, and particularly if you're interested in comparing and contrasting the 1917 Code of Canon Law with the 1983 Conciliar Code of Canon Law, as I like to call it, under John Paul II. And what you find is they don't always say things that are the same. Then in some cases, they're not really even very reconcilable. But there's a terrific resource. It's an English translation of the Latin text of the 1917 Code of Canon Law, also referred to as the Pio Benedictine Code because it was assembled during the pontificates of both Pius X and then completed under Benedict XV. And this translation was done by Dr. Edward Peters, a canon lawyer, and I think he might have had someone else participate in it. I don't remember. One of the cool things about it is for every canon in the 17 code that has a corresponding canon in the 83 code, he gives those numbers so you can cross-reference and compare them to one another. In any case, and with regard to a church being violated, in the 17 code, there's 4 things that can violate a church, a consecrated sacred space. And I'm going to read them to you. The first is the delict of homicide. So in other words, if someone's murdered in a church, it's considered violated. Secondly is an injurious and grave flow of blood. So if you have some violence that outbreaks in a church, and even if no one dies, but there's a grave flow of blood, that's enough to violate a church. The third thing, and this is the most interesting to me, because it applies not just to the naked guy, but something more, as I'm going to get to. Number 3, an impious or sordid use to which the church was put. Okay, so that speaks to this naked man climbing on the altar at St. Peter's. 4, the burial of an infidel or an excommunicate after a declaratory or condemnatory sentence. Okay, so let's go back to this number 3. Impious and sordid use to which the church was put. That's what happened when this naked dude got up on the altar. Now, in a violated church, we find in Canon 1173 that it's nefarious to celebrate the divine office or to administer the sacraments or to bury the dead in that church until it is reconciled. The next section says that a violated church is to be reconciled as quickly as possible according to the rites described in the approved liturgical books. And this is what happened. The rector of St. Peter's Basilica, just I think a couple days ago, carried out this rite of reconciliation of the church in light of what happened. And, you know, all other things aside, good for them for attempting to do the right thing. But I will say this to you folks. Think about this. What is more impious and what is more sordid than having the Novus Ordo Missae celebrated on an altar? I'm sorry, which one's more dangerous? Which one endangers more souls? In my view, it's not even close. Look, if somebody had walked into St. Peter's Basilica while this naked person is standing on the altar, there isn't a single solitary human being that would look at that and say, oh, that's the sacrifice of the Mass being offered to Almighty God, acceptable. No, they would look at it and go, this guy's a freaking nut job. You got to get him off of there, right? But if you walked into St. Peter's while the Novus Ordo Missae is being celebrated on the main altar, you're probably going to be fooled, unless your eyes have been opened wide. You're probably going to be fooled into thinking that you're looking at the holy sacrifice of the Mass being offered to God in an acceptable way and in a way that nurtures souls and guides them along the way of salvation safely. And it's not that. It's not that. The Novus Ordo is not a Catholic rite. This is one of the things that Brian McCall and I agree upon wholeheartely. That rite is intrinsically disordered. It's dangerous. It leads people astray and must be avoided. And so I would maintain that the Novus Ordo being celebrated on any altar, now this most certainly, in my view, qualifies as an impious and sordid use of that church and that sacred space. And therefore, in my estimation, you know, if we ever recover from this madness, churches all over the world need desperately to be reconciled. They need to be taken through a rite of reconciliation to be restored so that the holy sacrifice of the Mass, the traditional Roman rite, being, you know, the most noteworthy way in which the Mass can be celebrated on those altars again. So we have a situation where, you know, there's altars everywhere. I go to a Fraternity of St. Peter parish. That's my only option for the traditional Mass in my area that I can reasonably attend. I don't know if that place has been reconciled. If it was, I'm sure it was done I would imagine somewhat under the radar. I don't know. I doubt that it has been. But I can tell you there's a lot of altars out there that need to be reconciled. You know, you have a parish somewhere where the Novus Order is celebrated twice on a Sunday, and then in the afternoon, the traditional Mass. It's a bit of a problem. So if we ever emerge from this craziness that we're living through, there's an awful lot of restoration and reconciliation that needs to be taken care of in our sacred places. One last canon I want to read to you. As I was looking through Canon Law, reading about this idea of churches being violated and the necessity of reconciling them, I came across Canon 1160, which really caught my eye. Get this. Sacred places are exempt from the jurisdiction of civil authority, and in them the legitimate authority of the church freely exercises its jurisdiction. Of course, as soon as I read that, I immediately thought of the COVID madness of 2020. The civil authority ordered the bishops of the Catholic Church, or at least the men who claim to be the hierarchy of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, ordered them to cease offering the holy sacrifice of the Mass and administering the sacraments to their faithful in their sacred places. There's only one answer to that command coming to the Church from the civil authority, and that is what we see in Canon 1160. And that is to say that, hey, our sacred places are exempt from your jurisdiction. You have no jurisdiction in our churches. And again, I've complained about this before. There's not a single solitary bishop in the world who stepped up and made that case. I get it. Some priests flew under the radar and offered Holy Mass just the same. They didn't listen to the local decree saying that they couldn't do so. But there was such a magnificent moment there for some authority figure in the Catholic Church to stand up and say, hey, to the state, to the local civil authority, you have no jurisdiction over this place because we answer to Christ the King. It was a magnificent opportunity to proclaim the kingship of Christ and to assert his sovereign rights as king of this world, of this universe. And they didn't do it. And that's a terrible sin. It's a sin of omission for which many are going to have to answer. Last thing I want to tell you, this Canon 1160 in the 17 Code has a corresponding canon in the 1983 Code. It's Canon 1213, and it reads, the ecclesiastical authority freely exercises its powers and functions in sacred places. That's it. No mention of jurisdiction, no mention of exemption from the jurisdiction of the civil authority at all. These are, far from the same thing. Canon 1160 of the 1917 Code makes it perfectly clear that the civil authority has no jurisdiction in the sacred places of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. That's our domain. Ours. We are eminently free. Why? Because we are commissioned by Christ the King to carry out the command that he gave to us, that he gave to his church, that he gave to the apostles and the bishop and to the bishops who succeed them. And so the civil authority has no authority there whatsoever. Canon 1213 in the New Code, it simply says that the church authority is freely exercised within their sacred places. Duh. You could say the same thing about the Moose Lodge, right? You could say that the governing board of Moose Lodge 1242 down in Nowhereville is exercised freely inside the Moose Lodge itself. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it's very telling, because there's a tacit admission there in black and white that what happened at Vatican II with the birth of the conciliar church is exactly what Archbishop Lefebvre said happened. They have uncrowned him. They have totally set Christ the King and his sovereign rights in society off to the side, ignored it like they don't even exist. And that's where we are today. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, because we have this situation wherein this entity that claims to be the Catholic Church and has ceased proclaiming the kingship of Christ and any other number of immutable doctrines and is instead dispensing poison to the faithful, placing the eternal salvation of the innocent in grave jeopardy. It's for this reason that we're seeing such a terrible deficit in masculinity in our society today, and all of the ills that flow therefrom, and they are numerous. So that is the end of my rant for today. I know it was a little bit different. If you enjoyed it, let me know. If you didn't, let me know that too. And please do make liberal use of the comment section here. Do not behave as liberals in the comment section, but make liberal use of the comment section. Two different things. I want you to let me know what your thoughts are. I want you to ask questions. I want you to make suggestions. I want you to tell me to knock it off if that's what you think. And we'll pick it up from there. Do not let the fact that I don't engage in a lot of dialogue in these comment sections fool you. I am reading your comments. I'm not answering them there for the simple reason that I know if I start, I'll probably never stop. If I treat this comment section like a message board, it's going to gobble up way too much time. So please know that I'm reading your comments, and I will take them to heart and act on them as appropriate. Until next time, thank you for tuning in. I'll see you then. I'm Louis Verrecchio.